Hey, we're
Welcome
live.
to everybody. As
And
you can see, we are our usual organized selves. You would think
exactly.
that we didn't prep for this at all. And in fact, we're putting more
We
and more
did.
prep
We
time in
actually
every
prepped
week.
quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, we prep all the time. As you join us, if you can click that like button, it will help push us up in the algorithm of Substack. That it's very mysterious. Nobody knows how it works,
No one
but
knows how it works. Oh, let me put something on Twitter that we are actually going live.
yeah, I try to put a message out on Substack, and it was like, we don't recognize this person you say you're doing this with.
It's Substack has got some issues that we need
We
to.
we may at some point end up moving this to like YouTube or something,
Yeah, I think we may
podcast.
have to because it's really
It,
not. This is not ideal.
but um, for those of you who are here, please feel free to weigh in, write us messages if there are things you want us to weigh in on. We talked about some polls, we talked about some articles and columns today that we want to bring up. But we're open to talking about your topics, and then around 1 o'clock, we're gonna have a guest. A friend of mine is gonna come on and talk to us about the New Jersey governor's race.
Yeah.
Make sure we're better informed. But did you want to start with Trump or do you want to start with the shutdown?
So I guess the thing that there's a lot to talk about today, and we really do. Please put it in the chat again, as Brian said, whatever you want to talk about. There's just a lot going on, and I think one thing that I am really focused on that I don't think we're talking about nearly enough is how deeply unpopular Donald Trump is, and I just think this is the defining um, uh, uh, principle or element of current American politics that the President of the United States is at 41%, which is historically low for a first term president. His numbers have. Now, some people might say, well, he's always been unpopular, which is true. In his first term, he was based in the low 40s the entire time. But you have to remember that when he became president in January, he was above 50%, something he never achieved in his first term. And those numbers have gone south. I mean, you're talking a double digit shift in support against Trump. So that's one thing. The second thing is this weekend you had, literally 7 to 8 million people coming out into the streets of American cities across the country, small towns, big towns, what have you, um, protesting his presidency and the No Kings rallies. That is something that didn't happen with Joe Biden. It hasn't happened with any president except for Trump in his first term. So I think, you know, we talk a lot about Trump, we talk a lot about what Democrats need to do differently. But what is really happening now is that Trump is very unpopular. And that is an incredibly important development for, you know, what happens in American politics over the next year. Because more often than not, a midterm election is generally determined by, the biggest variable in determining how poorly a party does, an incumbent party does in a midterm election is how popular or unpopular the president is. And when you have an historically unpopular president, then that is going to have an effect. And I think you're going to see that, by the way, happening next month in New Jersey and Virginia in the governor's elections. But I think you're already seeing it, with some of the recruiting and some of the polling and some of the Democrats doing better in the polls. So I just think this is something we need to be focused on. I think constantly, the Trump's unpopularity is really important and it's really defining, and it is, I think, sort of being slept on by a lot of political analysts.
I would add just three things to that. First, I think that some of this is that Trump has a real give no fucks attitude,
He
for lack
does.
of a better way of putting it. Yesterday the news broke that he is going to approve a $230 million payment to himself from
To
the Department
himself.
of Justice,
Yes.
which is the most corrupt thing that any president has ever done ever. Demanding that his own subordinates approve a payment to himself
Of
from the
$230
federal
million.
treasury.
dollars.
And between that and the ballroom stuff, and that stuff only hurts because Democrats can easily point to the costs, the numbers, and say we can pay for veterans care for this many people with that, or we can pay for this with that. And it just promises to drive his unpopularity that much higher. Okay. And I think that Republicans are getting wrong. I know I had a bunch of conservative folks in my timeline or elsewhere saying, well, the No Kings rallies were sort of pointless or they showed the Democrats were obsessed with Trump. And I think the issue is, look, he has a high floor. um,
Yeah.
relative to where like George W. Bush or Jimmy Carter got to,
It's
or
not that
somebody
high
like
though.
that. No, it's
40%
not.
is not that high.
It no, all that saves him from is that last like 5-10% of dip into like the high 20s, low 30s,
Right.
where like Carter or W. Bush dropped to. And Republicans are missing that. Yes, I think Democrats have to walk a tightrope
Like
here
Carter.
because there was new Echelon Insights polling yesterday. I sent to Michael that was like 58% to 39%, something like that, cared more about the pocketbook issues
Yeah.
than they did democracy issues and things like that. So Democrats have to be careful that in their focus on Trump, they don't lose sight of the broader issues. But when a president is that unpopular, the people who are angry, the people who went out in the streets are the ones who are going to vote, volunteer, and door knock over the next year for candidates. And the fundraising numbers that came out last week were pretty good for Democrats. There's definitely a diminishment on both parties from where they were, the last couple of cycles, but those were good numbers. They have a lot of well-funded candidates who are going to be well-funded, and I think that that's a big impact. The other thing I want to respond to the comment that was in there. I didn't catch who said it, but asked whether redistricting would protect them. And so here's the thing. The difference between a midterm in 2026 and a midterm in 2006 is in 2006, the unpopular incumbent party, and this goes for 94 and 86 and 82, was going to get hammered everywhere. They were going to lose governor's races, they were going to lose Senate races, they were going to lose House races. In
Right.
2026, there is a certain insulation because of geographic polarization at the Senate level. If Democrats win 4 Senate seats, it will be like an avalanche.
Yeah.
Whereas it used
Absolutely.
to be that they could have gained 8, 10, 12 seats in a cycle. Okay. That would, maybe probably the most likely scenario I think is they gain 2 or 3 Senate seats. In the governor's races, I think you could see some, pickups for Democrats, even though they had a good cycle in 18 and 22. Remember, they picked up big time in 18, and then in 22 they held
Hold
all
on.
but
Time out,
Nevada.
Brent. We keep freezing. Is that really happening? I see Larry Simon say that. Does that keep happening that we're freezing up?
I don't see it, but I did get a message that my internet was unstable,
I
so
saw
that
that
could
too.
be.
I'm sorry if that's happening, but I didn't mean to
Yeah.
cut you off there, Brian. But just want to make sure we're not
Yeah.
having too many problems with the audio. Go ahead.
So the governor's races, Democrats had a great cycle in 18 because it was the first Trump midterm. Then
Yes.
22, they only lost Nevada. Okay. So and they gained Arizona, I believe. So you're in a situation where they're already in pretty good shape in governor's seats, but I could see them gaining in their 2 or 3 gubernatorial races, and I could see them getting trifectas in places, which is important because of what it
Sure.
does with districting. And then
Absolutely.
with the House, it broke inside of the last hour. Fox 59 and CBS 4, apparently owned by the same company, which tells us all kinds of things about the media in Indianapolis. Um, and they broke the news that the Indiana Senate Republican sources with them are saying that they don't have the votes in Indiana to move
That
forward.
is very interesting. I did
Yeah,
not see that, but that is
and
very interesting.
Trump called into their caucus meeting last week. He tried to brace them. They did add another seat in North Carolina this week. And certainly, look, I think we talked about this last week. If it was not for redistricting, the House would be done already.
I
The
agree.
Democrats are going to win more than 3 seats. Okay, if they maximize redistricting, it gives them a 50-50 shot, maybe more like 45% shot of holding the House, which is way more than they should have. So there is some chance that it insulates them, but you can only go so far. There's only so many seats they can redistrict.
And so,
And
right, and just to pick up on that point, I mean, I sent this around in my sort of the post today about what to read. Lou Jacobson is an old friend. He has who's works for Almanac American Politics, has a new Substack who's looking at basically breaking down various congressional districts. And he looked at the California primary and basically concluded that everyone is sort of saying that Democrats are going to win this redistricting vote in California, and they're going to get to add at least 5 new seats. So if you take those 5 seats plus the five that cancels out what Texas is doing. You're going to see Republicans pick up a few seats here and there. Uh, North Carolina, possibly, but maybe not Indiana. Democrats could still do something in Maryland or Illinois, possibly. I do think at the end of the day, the advantage for Republicans on the redistricting is actually relatively will be not as big as we thought it was going to be, and it needs to be huge for them to avoid losing uh, the House in 2026, and that's the bottom line.
I would just add though, yes, I think it may be less than we thought originally, but it's still unprecedented. It's still something where they're essentially stealing like 10 seats or 8 seats or whatever it is. Like this is something that has never been done. So
That's
I
true.
just want to make sure that we're people who don't understand this as intimately understand that this is still a very big deal.
It is a big deal, and it's bad. What Republicans are doing, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep adjusting this. I have this new lighting thing that I'm trying to get to work, and it's not. I keep getting a glare on my glasses. I don't know. We'll see if this works. You're right. What they're doing is not is basically trying to game the system in order to get more seats for themselves. Um, but look, traditionally, the party in power loses about 20 seats in a midterm election. It's a little tougher to lose 20 seats now because of the nature of redistricting and how many seats are basically closed off in the opposition. But again, I mean, if you look at the polling right now, Trump is at 41%. He is basically 15 points. I think he's 41.56 or 57, which is pretty far underwater. You have Democrats leading the generic ballot. You have the Gallup poll. There's a quarterly poll on partisan identification where they have Democrats at basically +7. Now, those numbers are, I wouldn't take them too seriously, but it is good. You rather be +7 than be -7 for Democrats. Um, I think you also see some of this in the recruiting, and I think this is going to eventually play out in some of the recruiting. Look, if next month uh, Democrats win in New Jersey and Virginia, I do think there's a real possibility that you have some Republicans who decide not to seek reelection in the House, seeing where the political winds are blowing. I think it does give a momentum boost to Democrats. I think it probably helps with their fundraising. And I think it probably calms some of the, I think, sort of oversized fears people have about what Democrats are doing. I mean, I saw this ridiculous piece by Easton Herndon in the Times over the weekend where he basically argued that like the centrists in the Democratic Party are on the retreat because of what's happening in New York City with Mamdani. But the reality, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just a ridiculous argument. I don't understand what he writes anymore. And the fact of the matter is that you have two centrists were nominated in Virginia and Georgia, and they look like they're on their way to win. So I just think that all I'm saying is, and I want to basically pick up on the point you made a second ago, is that Trump is flailing. He's doing things that are unpopular. You mentioned the destruction of the White House, the East Wing of the White House, which I think is going to have an effect, a negative effect. You're talking about the $230 million he's acting from the Justice Department that I cannot believe actually is going to happen because it is so politically toxic. It's so clearly
And by the way,
abuse of
congressional
power.
Republicans could stop all of this.
Of course they could, but they're not going to. And then we have the shutdown. I know we want to get into New Jersey, we want to get into the main situation, but we have to shut down really quick. The polling is very clear on this point. The Democrats are winning the shutdown blame game. There's just no question about it. They're winning, and I actually think the reason they're winning is not because their message is stronger, although their message is more. I did say this last week. I think their message is better, and it's more. They're clearer. There's more clarity from Democrats why they're shutting government down. But Trump is unpopular, so people are blaming Trump. I think it's very simple, actually, as to what's happening. And I made this point yesterday. Sometimes we complicate things in politics. You know, this is not very complicated right now. Donald Trump is unpopular, and that colors everything that is happening in politics. It colors the midterm election, these off-year elections. It colors the approval ratings. It colors people's views on the shutdown. It just defines everything. And but not only because Trump is the president, but because Trump is a dominant political figure. He gets a lot of attention for himself. So I just think that we need to be focused on this particular point that Donald Trump's unpopularity is a big deal.
I agree with that. There's two things I want to say about the shutdown, but before I get to that, I really think that all this Mondani stuff, and we'll talk about this more fulsomely either later or next week, but I really think it reflects a failing in the media, which is this obsession with New York City,
Yeah,
um,
I agree.
which
I agree.
really is not at all politically like America,
No.
and that doesn't tell us much. And the fact that a leftist won against a wounded, terrible
Yeah.
candidate in a primary in New York City tells us a grand total of zero about where the
I agree.
political climate is more broadly. Okay. And this idea that like you have to go to the left. Let me tell you something. We'll talk Plattner later, but all it's doing is exposing how unprincipled the left is in a lot of ways. And I really think that the media just is bored in these off years, and New York City's in their backyard, like they're there already. So it becomes a bigger story than it actually should be. So I really think that is just
No,
hogwash.
I want to just say I agree with everything you just said. I think if you're drawing conclusions about state of the Democratic Party based on what's happening in New York City, you're making a huge error. And I live here, and I can tell you that there is Mamdani has run a relatively good campaign, but I will also say that the main reason, I would argue, the only reason why he is going to become winning and become the next mayor is because he's running against Andrew Cuomo. And so two things happened here. Andrew Cuomo basically got into the race. He sucked up all the media attention. He sucked up all the money. He became sort of a dominant figure in the race, and uh, that meant that like nobody else could get traction and at least initially. And then Mondani got traction because he's really a perfect foil for Cuomo. He's not a politician, not a politician. He's a young guy. He's not not an establishment politician. He hasn't been around like a lot of other New York mayoral candidates. And so I think he was like a perfect contrast to Cuomo, and that's what I think allowed him to gain some traction. Plus, he got a lot of support among on the left. And I just think that and you have to remember, I voted. Somebody tried to attack me on this on Twitter today for saying this, but I was very clear in saying I voted against Mamdani. I voted for Cuomo. It's ranked voting in New York, so you vote the top five. I voted Cuomo number five. I voted my dog four because I didn't want to vote Cuomo. I just didn't want to vote. I wanted to vote Cuomo five, and I couldn't find four candidates I liked enough to put them on the thing. So I put three candidates I liked, and then I put my dog, and then I put Cuomo. But it was all just because I knew that by doing that, Cuomo would get the vote over Mamdani. It wasn't a vote for Cuomo. I don't like Cuomo. I really can't stand him on a personal level. I think he's a disreputable person. I think he would be a crappy mayor, but I think he'd be better than Mamdani. And that's why I voted for him. I don't actually know who I'm voting for in the election. I may just write somebody in. I'm not voting for Mamdani. I don't trust him. I don't think he's going to be a
Write
good
yourself
mayor.
in, Michael.
I'm sorry. I might write
Write
myself in.
yourself in.
I probably write my dog in. I just think that he is. I don't like him, and I'm not going to vote for him. But if he wins, I don't think it tells us a lot about where the country is going. So anyway, we've talked about
L-
New York.
Let
Let's
me
focus on. We want to get into New York, New Jersey pretty soon. We have to talk about the situation in Maine because.
let's
Go
hit
ahead.
the
Sorry. Go ahead.
shutdown real quick.
Yeah, shut
There's
down
two
really quick.
things I want to throw in on the shutdown. And if we have to punt Maine to later, we will get to it. I promise, because we both have a lot to say on that. On the shutdown, two things that have occurred to me in the last 24 hours. The first is it is really exposing how much the Senate is a changed place from
Yeah,
when all of us were younger. The Senate used to be the more moderate branch where sober, serious minded people outside of the leadership came in and said, hey, let's cut a deal, let's end this. Well, all those people are gone. There are like no moderates left in the Senate, okay? You have people who have never voted against their leadership, like ever, who are theoretically talking with one another, but they're not moderates. They're not predisposed to dealing. They're from red states or blue states. And so that really forestalls a lot of possibilities here and is going to make this drag out. And the other
sure.
thing that I think is very important, and this ties to Maine, you have a situation where the base of the Democratic Party is very, very, very unhappy with its own leadership. So unhappy and so anti establishment that they're willing to back someone who is showing himself to have more baggage than a 747 fully loaded. Okay. He's Plattner is that guy at this point. Okay.
He is
And they're
that guy.
so angry about that. So why does this matter for the shutdown? It matters for the shutdown because it makes it nearly impossible for Democrats to do a deal or to reopen the government without getting something because they cannot afford to anger their base more because their base threatens to lead them into cul-de-sacs in primaries in 2026 to
That is
like
true.
lash out mindlessly and nominate people who can't win. So I
That's true.
think that that is going to prolong this shutdown that much longer because Republicans are going with the usual line of, well, we won't negotiate with legislative terrorists, basically. reopen the government, and then we'll talk. And Democrats absolutely cannot do that. That
Oh,
would be very foolish.
I'm going to push back. I'm not sure I agree with you on this one because I think actually I think Republicans are much more likely to fold because they are playing a losing hand. And you're already seeing some evidence that Republicans are looking for an off ramp here. I think the Democrats are emboldened by the shutdown, emboldened by the fact they're not getting blamed for it, that they see this messaging as working. They see Republicans on the defensive. They see Republicans looking for an exit ramp. And I think, look, I would agree with you that the shutdown was driven in part by sort of coalition politics in the sense that they wanted to appease the Democratic base. But okay, this is worse than Rogan. That's a harsh comment. That they wanted to appease the Democratic base. But I also think that that they've done that and they succeeded in that. But I think Democrats would be happy to end this tomorrow if Republicans met them halfway, which I suspect Republicans will. And again, I've said this like many times on this discussion. At the end of the day, Republicans are better off making a deal. Right? They
Sure.
they 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 need a deal because premiums are going to go up. Obamacare premiums are going to go up, and when that happens, it's going to hurt them politically. So I think
And the next inflection points, the next 10 days to 2 weeks, as people start to get their premium numbers and see how high they're going,
exactly.
that may put more pressure on Republicans. Let's try to squeeze Maine in a little bit here, and we can always come back to it. Does
We'll
that
come back
sound
to it. Yeah, I gotta. Okay, this main thing is got to be the craziest thing I've seen in politics in a very long time. Graham Plattner, who, of course, announced he was running a few months ago, got a lot of attention from the left, raised a lot of money, got endorsement from Bernie Sanders, he got endorsement from a couple other sort of left liberal members of the U.S. Senate and the House. Um, Over the last week, we have seen just a torrent of stories about this guy's background, his postings on social media in which he made all kinds of crass comments about black people, about women. He used
cop?
the cops. He's lots of criticisms of cops. And then this week, it turned out we discovered that he has a actual Nazi insignia tattoo on his
Had
chest.
until an hour ago, Michael. Had.
Okay, and he claimed he didn't know what it was, although there's a lot of sources that say that that's not true. His political director resigned and basically said he's lying about this. I mean, this guy is a walking disaster politically. Uh, I'm sorry, Greg. I don't know what you're referring to about the sitting in the higher cabinet, but I will try to get to your question at some point. Um, so so this guy is a dead man walking, right? He is a opposition researcher's dream, and if I'm the Republicans, I'm going to just run against this guy because, and by the way, we don't even know what more there is about him, right? This is the thing about how crappy a candidate he is. His own people didn't vet him. If they had vet him, they would have known about some of this stuff. They didn't apparently know about it. And Janet Mills, her campaign figured out because as soon as she announced she was running, she just dumped all of it. She just dumped everything on it. She's
No,
trying to
no,
kill this guy in the crib.
that's what's even worse, though, is that Jonathan Martin, the very well sourced Politico columnist, wrote this morning that there's a whole lot more coming. Uh,
Yes. So the thing is, like, this is why you don't get excited about candidates that are unknown, that have never been vetted, that have never run, because inevitably they haven't been vetted, and Janet Mills, whether you like her or don't like her, has been in public office since before Graham Plattner was born. Right, her first elected office she won 1980. So the idea that you would prefer this Plattner guy, and here's the crazy thing about this, that all these stories, people are still defending him. And I'm like, what is
uh,
this? Actually reminds me in a weird way of like Joe Biden dead enders. Because in a way you're saying like the candidate is more important than winning the race. And like I was somebody who initially said I think Biden should drop out. And then when it became clear that he was a dead man walking and that he had lost support in the party, my view was like he needs to go. Right. Politics is not for the soft hearted. You cannot be sympathetic to a politician. Politicians are a means to an end. You elect the president because you want to further your agenda. It's not about the politician. It's about what they represent. And if Joe Biden was a problem, then you get rid of him. If Graham Plattner is a problem, then you get rid of him and you go with the candidate who is more likely to win. But so many of these mostly progressives, but also all the Obama stands from Pod Save America, they're all just like it's like Plattner owes them money or they owe Plattner money. It's bizarre. I can't understand why they are not realizing this guy is damaged goods.
And it's so much worse than that because they're being insulting and condescending, these Plattner people, of saying, oh,
100%.
well, if you want to win back young men, you can't just say no to some guy who said objectively racist, misogynistic things and has a Nazi tattoo on him, as if all American young men have Nazi tattoos, on their body. It is the most condescending, obnoxious thing that there is towards young men and who they are and what they're. Look, I think cancel culture is stupid. I have a lot of sympathy for Graham Plattner on a human level. A lot of people come back from combat service bitter, angry, disillusioned with all kinds of issues. I, believe in extending those people grace, and there may be a point that he is viable to run for an office. But first of all, you don't get in at the top, at the U.S. Senate level. And secondly, I really think we have to differentiate between places where there is no bench and a place like Maine where you've got a two-term governor. I mean, but to see these people, Martin Heinrich, the senator from New Mexico, and Bernie saying like, let's deflect off to policy issues. I'm worried about this, not about like social media posts or things. Like these people are just be clowning themselves to stick with this guy in this race when there is another option out there who is got a proven track record. If this was Florida, maybe yeah, because why not throw the Hail Mary, even though the chances of success are low. But this is Maine. It is a
So,
blue state. It is your best shot
best
at
chance.
picking up a seat.
So let me say this: I'm all about extending grace to people. I truly mean that. I'm a very person. I believe in forgiveness and I believe in redemption. Not when it comes to a U.S. Senate race in which Democrats have a chance of winning. Okay, grace is fine. It doesn't apply in this particular situation. Graham Plattner is somebody, by the way, that most of these people who are lobbying for him, they didn't even know who he was 2 months ago. Okay, why they are basically going to the mat, they're dying on the hill of Graham Plattner, I have no idea. All I know is that I don't give a shit about Graham Plattner if I'm a Democrat. I don't, he is irrelevant. What is relevant is how Democrats win the main Senate seat. That is all that matters. Nothing else. And if he's the best candidate to do it, then fine. But he's not the best candidate to do it. We know this. We know the fact that he has so many vulnerabilities that will be used against him by a Republican opponent, Susan Collins. That we know that Janet Mills, who has her own set of vulnerabilities, not a perfect candidate, does not have the same kind of skeletons in her closet that Plattner does. This isn't even a close call, okay? This is about Democrats winning back power. And all I've been hearing for the past year is how Democrats need to moderate their positions and nominate people who are, who might be might have not take liberal positions on every single issue. And yet here they are getting behind a candidate who is a walking time bomb for the Democratic Party. And it is, I don't get it. And I'll say one more thing too. This idea that you need to nominate Graham Plattner to win over young men. Maine is one of the oldest states in the country.
No, it's the oldest.
The oldest state in the country. It just reelected an 80-year-old U.S. senator. Okay? Graham Plattner might be 41 years old. He is not the way to win a Senate seat in Maine. He just isn't. And this is another thing too, where you are fighting the last war. Okay, the fact that Democrats did poorly among young men in 2024 is not. You have to correct that. It's like in a vacuum. If you correct that one issue, you'll do better. No, it's not how it works. Okay, young people are not the key voting bloc. They, generally speaking, don't vote. They don't vote in midterm elections. If you want to win in Maine, and you want to win anywhere in 2026, you need to get out Democratic voters. And who are those people? They're Black people. They're suburban women. Okay, that's who is votes the most in for Democratic Party, and that's who you to get out and vote. Graham Plattner will help you with none of those. And it is exhausting to watch these bros consistently argue that we have to get better with young men. In some places, yes, but not in Maine, and not with this terrible, terrible candidate.
Yeah, I agree with that. Um, Michael, if you can send our guest the link he needs.
S- So I don't
Uh,
actually. He has to be on the call for me to do it, and I don't see him on here. So I'm going to try to
okay,
see if I
hold
can
on.
find him.
We're flying by the seat of our pants here, trying to bring a guest on. Um,
Uh, there he is, Stephen Danley. That is his name,
yeah,
correct?
yes, that's
I
correct.
just invited him to join, and he should be with us in a second. But I'm sorry to harp on this point, but
No, but
yikes.
you're right. The thing that matters most, that there's one thing that both you and I care about, and it can be summed up in one word: winning. That is what matters. And this guy, there's a lot more I have to say on this, and we can get to it later after we talk New Jersey. But it really infuriated me yesterday, especially because pragmatism and winning go together. And that means you find the right candidate for every state or district, and it means you don't chase the last war. You look at what comes next. I mean, you come out of a loss, a bad election cycle, and we just don't know where things are going to be in a year or 3 years. You pick the best possible candidates that you can find. And last week it wasn't clear that that wasn't Graham Plattner. It is now. This is a guy who is an opposition researcher's dream. Susan Collins if he won this primary, Susan Collins would be wondering how she ever got so
How she
lucky.
got so lucky to face the. She is. I assure you, there's nothing that she wants more than to face off against Graham Plattner.
That's absolutely right. All right, I see our guest has joined us. This is my friend Steve Danley. He is a professor at Rutgers Camden, runs a center there. Fun fact, he also has a really good hook shot. He was an outstanding college basketball player. Um,
Stephen, great to have you here.
it's
Yeah,
great
thanks
to
for
have him
having me
with
on.
us. And he is at the heart of the more interesting governor's race at this point. It maybe shouldn't have been that way, but New Jersey is seemingly closer than Virginia at this point. And so we thought we'd have someone on who understands New Jersey politics more intimately than either Michael or I. So,
Yeah,
so
Stephen. Yeah, it's great to have you here. Thank you, Brian, for introducing him. And I want to ask you this. I mean, look, there's been a lot of speculation back and forth about. I guess for a while, people thought that Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, looked like a good
you're talking
favorite
about
to
Mikey
win.
Sherrill in
I'm sorry,
New Jersey.
apologize, Mikey
They're really close
Sherrill.
friends. It's easy
They're
to
very
make
close friends. They're
confuse
both
them.
centrist female veterans, but Mikey Sherrill, people were saying that she was going to be, look like a good odds-on favorite to win this race. The polls seemed to tighten somewhat in September, but now latest polls seem to show her ahead. Where do you think this race is going?
Yeah, I think there's always a local story that's a little different than the national story. And the story locally has been that New Jersey politics has been tightening. That you see some of the national trends and particularly the coalition changes around the Trump administration and Trump's coalition on the right. And it really impacts New Jersey in surprising ways. So you look at the last gubernatorial election, it was much, much tighter than expected, with Murphy, the incumbent, kind of squeaking by Cettarelli. And you look at the Trump Biden.
Let me
Yeah,
interrupt one second. Jack Ciattarelli, he is the Republican nominee. He ran 4 years ago against Murphy. He lost by, I believe, 3 points. Is that correct?
yep.
Yeah.
And he
Hey,
ran also 4 years before that in the primary, but he lost. So
yeah.
he's the second time he is running for governor. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so and then if you just look at the Trump Harris outs, some of the trends that you saw all around the country, particularly around Latino populations, really changed the race in New Jersey. And New Jersey was much closer in the presidential race than anyone expected. So
Right.
I think there's reasons to think that this is tightening, that it's really been, you know, the change in coalition around urban communities, the change in the coalition around Latino communities mean this one's going to come to the wire.
So the thing I have noticed, though, was sort of interesting about New Jersey. You mentioned what happened in 2024 with Harris and Trump. That was a close election, but have you seen that kind of closeness in other New Jersey statewide elections? I know you mentioned with Murphy in the governor's race, but like in the Senate races, for example. I mean, are Republicans making inroads on congressional races? They're making inroads in local elections in New Jersey.
Yeah, you didn't see it in the last Senate race with Andy Kim winning, but you did see it kind of in specific districts. And going back a little bit further, I think the real bellwether on this, and we can talk Jersey politics. I think we can understand Jersey politics as being a conflict between Republicans and Democrats, and maybe that's super relevant with the gubernatorial race. But The better way to understand Jersey politics historically is a conflict between Giants fans and Eagles fans, which is to say, there's a north part of the state which is really dominated by New York and by the regions that are around New York, and that's a little more progressive. And then you have a South Jersey of the state that's sort of
Right.
like a little brother, much, and that's dominated by the Philadelphia metro area, and that's where you have the South Jersey Eagles fans are every bit as diehard as your South Philly Eagles fans, and that's really dominated state politics. But what's changed is that South Jersey Democrats used to be conservative and used to be able to hold rural areas. And as the coalition has changed nationally, and there's fewer voters that are willing to be in rural areas and vote for Democrats based on union issues or these other things, you've seen Democrats kind of lose power in that area. So when Steve Sweeney, who was the head of the Senate here,
Right.
lost to a trucker, right? You look and you say now that coalition is harder to keep together. And so there's a sense of changing state dynamics, even if it doesn't manifest in every election. The other thing that's really weird, and that's kind of the counterbalance to this, is that New Jersey is often responding to the national election. So you have Obama get elected, and then you get a Republican in Chris Christie. You
Right.
have Trump get elected, you get a more progressive candidate that you had in decades in Phil Murphy, right? And so there's this kind of counterbalance thing. And so the general consensus seems to be that the Senate race just kind of went straight through as a response to this pushback from the right, but that this one's really tightening up.
But I think there's got to be another dynamic at play here, which is that right, Murphy's not terribly popular,
Right.
uh, and I this is a crazy stat, but I had seen this recently that in New Jersey, no party has won three straight elections since 1960 or 62, I believe it is.
Yep.
So the deck should be historically stacked against Cheryl. But as you mentioned, these elections, these off-year elections in New Jersey and Virginia, they tend to go against the party in power, right? I mean, we've seen this over and over again, as you just mentioned a second ago. So I guess you have two dynamics here. One is that a desire for change and the difficulty in winning three straight elections, which we see on the presidential level as well. It's always hard to win three straight elections, but that is this in conflict with clearly the anti-Trump animus that is out there in the electorate right now. And look, based on the polls, it seems Cheryl is doing a little better because there is a lot of anti-Trump animus out there. But I mean, am I characterizing the race correctly as basically being sort of like the traditional Republican, traditional New Jersey state issues as far as the governor's race versus these national issues?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. And this is why I kind of pose this. This is a poller's nightmare, which is to say there's a bunch of different historical trends that you might weight in different ways when you're doing your polling in terms of whether turnout will be high. Is it a historical reaction? What does it mean to come after kind of these two consecutive Democratic terms, which would normally mean a swing to the right, but coming after a swing to the right nationally, which normally means a swing to the left.
Right.
Um, and I think it's one of the reasons you've seen I am less convinced than other folks that this race has been as volatile as the polling seems to indicate. I
Interesting.
think what's happening is behind the scenes, folks are weighting these historical factors in terms of turnout and in terms of whether or not you'll see low turnout rural voters come out for an off year gubernatorial race. I think they're starting to weigh these things differently. And that's why you got the general sense in Jersey was that there was kind of those early polls that showed Cheryl up big were always overinflated, and there's
Yeah, it
been
seemed
kind of
that way.
a calculation behind the scenes. Um, and then the other piece of this is the retail stuff still matters. And Congresswoman Cheryl has run a deeply small C conservative race, right?
Interesting.
I'm not going to. There's very few kind of big policy proposals that kind of shake up or motivate folks. There's a lot of folks on the progressive side who are kind of a little frustrated, but she's kind of counting on them to come out, run a race where the fundamentals will carry her to the finish line.
So, I mean, is she running? Is she basically running a race where she's trying to link? I mean, I've seen some ads where she tried to link Citarelli to Trump. Is that basically the crux of the campaign she is running?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the campaign has two parts. The campaign is, I'm a helicopter pilot, I'm a
Right.
congresswoman, I'm exactly what you want if you're a candidate that's looking to win with a path through these suburban districts and kind of run up the score with soccer moms that are really worried about Trump. And then on the other hand, tie Chattarelli as closely to Trump as possible. And that's really there hasn't been a big kind of policy conflict. There hasn't been a lot of really progressive policy in a way that I think some folks wanted further on the left. There's been this kind of run down the middle, tie to Trump, and just count on kind of the advantage in total number of Democrats in the state to carry to the finish line.
I made this
And
point. Yes, go ahead, Brian. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, does this really highlight the difficulties in sort of the holding together this Democratic coalition? It strikes me that the party has gained in the New Jersey suburbs. Cheryl's own seat, that had not been won by Democrats in a very long time before she won it. That like she has that appeal, but is struggling in some of these in the urban communities. I think about the fact that it's Nellie Poo's district out of Newark that like Trump won, that it flipped like 20 points from 2020 to 2024, where maybe she has less of an appeal there, and that the Democrats are struggling because they have two elements of their coalition that want fundamentally different things
Yeah.
in terms of what the ideal looks like. Is that at play here?
Yeah, this is a complicated one. Actually, I have a doctoral student that's doing a dissertation, CJ Flex. CJ is really, really fantastic, talented student who's doing a dissertation on strong and weak parties, and particularly mechanisms in Jersey that parties use to kind of enforce control over who runs for office and party discipline. And New Jersey has historically been well positioned to kind of enforce the party's will or the party's preferred candidates. And this is, I think, for better or worse, depending on how you feel about it, which is to say that there have been these historical ways of doing that, largely through strong county committees that wielded this thing in New Jersey that was known as the line, where
All
you could
right.
actually design the ballot to support your candidates. And then you had kind of what some folks will call like political machines. You have these really kind of strong political infrastructures that are fed by donations that fund campaigns at a high amount. And it's meant over time that in Jersey, they haven't felt this fracture in the same way because the parties put the thumb on the scales. And I think what you're actually seeing here is kind of the opposite. The candidates that really wanted to lean into those differences were Raz Baraka and Steve Fulop, and they had a ton of progressive energy. And the party infrastructure was just too strong across the state. They didn't
Hmm.
end up making a serious run. And so I think Cheryl's kind of counting on the opposite, that she can bring folks in. The real question, if you look at the numbers from the Trump election, and Nellie Poo's district is a great example of this, is what's going on with the Latino districts. Because New Jersey, lost so much ground, particularly in Latino districts, and the suspicion is this is Latino men. That seems like, and is that a story of progressive policies? Is that I don't know, but I think
Well,
that's the
I have a
best.
theory on that, if I
All
can
right,
put it
give me
out
the
there.
theory because I want to know.
It's actually backed up by the data, but the decline in Hispanic men is really a function of Democrats nominating a female presidential candidate in 2016, 2024. If you look at the Catalyst exit poll numbers from both those elections, you know, first of all, there's a drop off among every single male demographic from 2020 okay, there's a drop off from 2012 to 2016 among men. There's an increase in 2020, and there's a decline in 2024. It's hard not to circumstantially make the case that that's because there was a male in 12 and 20 and a female on the top ticket in 16 and 24. But the drop off among Hispanic men was particularly pronounced. Now, I should say there was a drop off among Hispanic women as well. So Democrats did poorly across the board, but they did much worse among Hispanic men. And you saw this also in 2012, 2016. You saw it with black men as well. So my theory on this is that basically, Democrats paid a price with minority men in nominating a female nominee. Well, I shouldn't say that. They paid a tax with all men because they lost the board among the white men as well, while basically breaking even with white women. Basically from 2020, 24, no change among white women, drop off among white men. So I think that's what's happening there. And that's why I'm sort of suspicious that what happened in 2024 is really all that relevant to this election or even to future elections, is because you saw this across the board, across the country, that Trump, first of all, Trump is very good at he's shown an ability to bring out voters who will only vote for Trump, who are like just Trump only voters. And you've also seen that Democrats have paid a price with male voters for nominating women. I don't know that that's going to continue if, say, 28, if Democrats nominate a man and Trump isn't on the ticket.
And I do think that there's a broader just gap between men and women, and I think it's maybe even more pronounced in the Latino community. Puck Peter Hamby had this last night from their new Puck Echelon Insights poll on ICE, on the ICE arrests. Women were 20 points less likely to support ICE than men were. Only 37% of women backed the agency in its enforcement efforts, and 57% of men. So there's a real gap between men and women on a lot of different political issues that's at play.
Oh no, but that gender gap goes back to the 90s. But I'm saying that you can see a specific drop off with male voters
Yeah.
from between 2012 and 2024, and it is sort of coded to whether there's a woman on the ticket or not. Again, goes down in 16, up in 20, and then down in 24. Democratic support among male voters.
And it's the Latino men that Steve's talking about in North Jersey, in like Newark area. But it's also the guy I feel like when Steve was talking about South Jersey that I think we have to bring up is Jeff Andrew, the dentist
Right.
from the Jersey Shore, who was somehow supporting Cory Booker for 2020 until he voted against Trump's first impeachment and realized he had to switch parties because he could never win another primary, and all of a sudden has become a dyed-in-the-wool Trumper. But he was always culturally conservative. He was always anti-choice and
Right.
anti-LGBTQ marriage, but was always a blue-collar economic conservative. And now you're seeing him like, hey, I can vote for the big beautiful bill, even though it cuts Medicaid left and right, kind of thing. So that him and his district down the Jersey Shore is, I think, the real spot where Democrats have permanently lost ground. The Latino men, it's a little bit hazier as to how permanent this is or isn't, right, Steve?
Yeah, well, I'll say, Michael, it's a great theory, and I'm sure all your viewers from the Buttigieg offices, campaign offices that will get going are like cheering because we're like, oh, we can deal with this in 28. It's not super comforting to folks who have an election in 2-3 weeks in New Jersey who are sitting there go, well, we nominated a woman.
Yeah, but I don't.
So,
Okay. But let me interject because
yep.
what we've seen is that the gender issue does not play the same way down ballot. It doesn't play with Senate candidates. It doesn't play with gubernatorial candidates in the same way. And I point to 24 as a good example. Yes, Trump beat Harris, but you look at like states like Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin. Trump won all three of those states, but a female Senate candidate won. So I think that I think the tax on a female candidate is much more pronounced presidential election than in gubernatorial or Senate elections. In fact, I don't think
You're
there
not
really
the
is evidence of it, a tax on that.
you're not the commander in chief. I mean, some of this comes down
Exactly.
to that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go the masculinity direction, and I think the rural. I'm happy to talk kind of South Jersey politics as well. But yeah, I think if that holds, right, then I think you're probably seeing a Cheryl 5 or 6 point win, where the demographics have changed, so it's not as much of a blowout. But I think that's the demographic that's going to be the hinge demographic here, and that's that kind of where I'll be looking first at the early returns
Well,
is those Latino counties.
so let me enter one thing too. I want to ask you about. New Jersey used to be a swing state. Republicans used to win. I remember Tom Kaine was like a twice elected governor in New Jersey. I grew up
Christy Whitman.
Christy Whitman. I grew up outside of Philly, and I can remember Tom Kaine's thick. I don't understand that accent. If it's, I guess it was it's like a Boston accent, but he's from New Jersey, clearly. Anyway, but what seems to have shifted is that suburban voters, particularly in the last 10 years, suburban voters have gone dramatically against the Republican Party. So it seems to me like as much as the Democrats might have problems with Hispanic voters, I mean, they've got huge advantages with suburban voters. We've got to help them in New Jersey, I have to think.
Yeah, and I think that's why you see Cheryl running the campaign she's running is you look and there's just a lot more Democrats registered than Republicans. Now, what's
Yeah.
interesting is that gap is closing, right? So we're seeing an increase in that. I think that's driven largely by the rural dynamics Brian was talking about, and some of these gender dynamics, which are really tough. But the gap's closing, and so now we have kind of these two different theories of the race. There's one is the Cheryl campaign is essentially doubling down and saying, we hold the advantage. If we hold the suburbs, we hold the
Right.
line, we win. It was closer than expected for the presidential race. A bunch of things went wrong, but it still wasn't nip and tuck. It still was
Right.
a fairly, we weren't really counting. It was called early. And so you have this kind of run it safe, run a candidate that shows up well in a lot of different places across the space that has a good resume. And then you have this kind of Republican thing that's happening, which is let's lean a little bit in, which is not how those Republicans won historically, right? Keene, a moderate, Whitman, a moderate. There was this tradition of moderate Republican. And the
Yes.
sense now is maybe in a low turnout race, we can drum up enough enthusiasm off cycle to kind of win with the base a little bit more. And that's kind of, the big question was, would Cettarelli run away from Trump once he got the nomination? And he largely hasn't, right? He's largely leaned in. I don't think the aesthetic is exactly the same. I think the aesthetic is a little more polished, a little more traditional politician. But in terms of kind of leaning into MAGA, there's been more of that than I think the old school folks who are looking for a Keene kind of expected.
Yeah, I
He's
want to
throwing
just
MAGA hats at his rallies to people, and apparently Trump is going to do a virtual event for him next week, which I think actually highlights the tightrope he's trying to walk, which is they don't want to get it onto the local news. They don't want there to be video of the two of them standing together and
right.
Trump talking in New Jersey, but they want to do enough that he helps to try to bring out those not every election Trump voters. I wanted to ask Steve one question about uh,
Before you
Shirley.
go, Brian, I want to give a shout out to Lynn Muster in the chat, who basically made the same point about Whitman and Keene being old style
Yeah,
Republicans
and
before.
by the way,
So thank you for that,
Christy
Lynn.
Christy Whitman is a Democrat now, I
Yeah,
believe.
she's Democrat now. Yeah,
She's voting for all the Democrats. Keene, it's a little bit different because his son is a Republican congressman, so whatever he
right.
actually believes, he can't say.
He
But I
can't
want to
say.
ask Steve, Chiarelli has made a pretty big deal about how he's putting in like the kind of pounding the pavements in minority neighborhoods, that he's putting in, making an effort to try to win, to cut into Democratic margins. Is that something that could pay dividends? Is it, more pro forma than actual? What's going on there?
Well, there's a theory kind of among Republicans that these changes are happening fast across the state. And so if you're plugged into Republican circles here, there's a talk at making a run for the assembly seats and kind of for a majority in the assembly across a lot of spaces. And I think, Michael, I'm like a little more in your camp where it's you saw a big turnout in the presidential race and now we'll see some regression. But if
Yeah,
folks are looking at a trend line and saying we made up a certain number of points, and if we're going to take another jump forward and there's kind of this momentum around voter registration. And when I see a candidate at the top of the ticket that's going to places, I think it's a little less about the governor's race, and it's a little more about supporting those assembly candidates all the way up and down the ticket. Even though I think it would take a pretty big break from any polling I'm seeing for that type of a swing to happen. But folks are talking about it.
so the thing that you said about Chiarelli, that he's not distancing himself too much from Trump, I think is interesting. I mean, is the logic here that he probably is swimming against the tide in a state like New Jersey, and so he really needs to sort of activate those Trump only voters who came out in big numbers for Trump in 2024? I mean, is that the logic here from your sense of it?
Yeah, I think my sense of it is that like many other places, the kind of MAGA coalition is winning at the state Republican level. Like the idea, like we're out through this kind of moment when Trump was an anti-establishment figure, and now like the state party is now shifting more that way.
Right,
These kind of different things, and there's a sense here that it's been reasonably effective in New Jersey, that it's been closer, that there's momentum, that it's good strategy. We'll see how it plays out. I mean, hitching yourself to Trump in a blue state is a dangerous thing, not just because there's so many folks that it's a non-starter for, and you're fighting kind of in these suburbs for your life for these voter margin, but also because part of the Trump administration politics is punishing blue states right now.
right,
So we just saw this cancellation of all these dollars for the Gateway project in to connect North Jersey
right,
to New York. These are the types of things that play huge here there's a whole bunch of folks who are only paying so much attention to this race, who all of a sudden are hearing about how their commute is not going to be cut short, how the
right.
right. And this is the thing that surprised me is as much as both campaigns seem to be leaning into this being a national race, all the policy discussion is basically about property taxes. It's
Yeah,
basically
well,
about
it's New
cost of
Jersey, right?
living. Yeah, and it's coming back to the retail
That's
folks.
how Christy Whitman won in
That's up
1993,
with you.
and I don't think it's changed since then.
Yeah.
Well, didn't she win? Well, she ran because Jim Florio raised taxes and everyone was pissed
Right.
off at him about it.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. But that's what I'm saying. Like New Jersey raises, living in Philadelphia, you see all their ads, and it's been property taxes, property taxes, property taxes for decades.
And this is the other kind of sneaky retail issue, is, the electric costs are just spiking here in New Jersey, and it's
Mhm.
happening around the country, and it's tied to AI and tied to some of these different things. But here the Murphy administration closed a nuclear power plant, and it meant that we're kind of seeing these big spikes. And I think this is actually the issue that is kind of flying beneath the radar, but may hurt
Interesting.
Democrats the most. Is that Democrats have been in control and kind of are having to own and eat this property increase. I mean, this electric, gas and electric bill increase, and I kind of think that's where, that's the other place. I don't know that you'll get good enough exit polls to know like what the key issue is. But if you see like really surprising swings, I think it's just going to be cost of living, and if that's owned by Democrats in New Jersey, we've seen a lot of places flip based on that kind of simple metric.
I want to get back to one thing you said a second ago about the we talked about trying to sort of activate the Trump coalition that came out in 24. I think this is the real challenge for Republican candidates going forward. Trump's not going to be in the ticket again in 28. Well, I mean, we assume he won't be. He's not. He's not supposed to be. We've seen when Trump's not on the ticket since 2016, Republicans have performed badly. Right, lost 2018. I mean, he was on the ticket in 20. Um, uh, Obviously, and he lost 22. Republicans underperformed. They did better in 24 with him on the ticket. And I think there's reason to believe that without him on the ticket, he can't activate those voters. And so I think it was interesting to see. I think if Chitterley wins by basically getting those Trump voters to go out and vote, that's a huge thing for the Republican Party, because it would suggest that they are able to reach those voters that have so far been only Trump voters. Personally, I'm skeptical that's going to happen because it hasn't happened anywhere else. But I mean, I think that would be an interesting takeaway from this if he wins. I mean, I guess from your perspective, if Chitterley wins, or I mean, if Cheryl wins, what do you should we take away a lot from this, or do you think this is a New Jersey centric result?
Um, I think the thing I would look at is it a high turnout race or a low turnout race?
Got it.
And if you see a Republican win or even a Republicans overperforming in a super high turnout race, then you're seeing some evidence that this is carrying forward this kind of Trump realignment and Trump momentum. If
Right.
what you see is a really low turnout race in which the fundamentals, the history, the areas are kind of holding, and you're just seeing a lot of low turnout voters fall off the map. Um, that's just always the story of New Jersey off-cycle politics. Like it's always a little like it's hard to get booked
Right.
out the year after a presidential race. It's these are, you talk we're talking about the gubernatorial race, but these assembly races, a lot of them historically, there's not even a challenger in these districts because it's just so hard to kind of rally the resources and the energy and all of these pieces. And so that's really the thing I'm looking for. Um, if it's Cheryl, I think it's interesting because it plays a little bit to this idea that what Democrats need to do is find kind of safe, more centrist candidates that aren't playing into the cultural wars as much. And I do think that there's like a little bit of momentum like in that direction from elements of the Democratic Party, right? That the way we win these seats is not putting up controversial figures. It's of course funny because it's kind of the opposite of what's happening on the right.
Of course.
But yeah, and that I think would be my biggest takeaway. But that's partially because it's so explicitly the Cheryl campaign strategy. Don't
I
make
mean,
waves, lean on the fundamentals.
didn't Cheryl have? I mean, she was challenged. I mean, Josh Gottheimer was pretty moderate, challenged
Yep.
her. Ross Baraka, who's the mayor of
Newark.
Newark, thank you,
Mhm.
sorry,
Yep.
challenged her. He's from the left. I mean, she is a centrist. I mean, one thing I found so strange about some of the commentary that Democrats need to nominate more moderate candidates is first of all, they already do that. I
Right.
mean, you could look at every single swing state. They nominate much more moderate, generally sort of milquetoast candidates
Yep.
to win. Chris Hayes had a big piece over the weekend about how Democrats need to get more attention-seeking candidates, and I'm just like, where's the evidence for that? They continue to nominate people who
I
are,
mean,
not incredibly charismatic necessarily, but effective sort of middle of the road, sort of milquetoast politicians. I mean, isn't Cheryl fall into that category?
Yeah, I think and I think falls into the category intentionally. I think she could be
Yeah,
running a
right,
campaign that
exactly.
that picks up a lot more of these issues. You know, she's been very quiet on immigration. She's been very quiet on a number of kind of key issues. There's kind of the progressive energy in the state has ended up being linked a lot to Andy Kim, which is funny because Kim's not that progressive of a kind of
Right.
figure nationally. But here, the progressives like him because he's challenged a lot of establishment Democrat figures on kind of key issues, including the line. He's the one that brought the lawsuit for the line.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
this is the piece of this that I think is the super Jersey specific piece. I don't think this is happening, but there's been a little buzz about this. So in the second Christie race, Barbara Bono runs against Chris Christie, and South Jersey Democrats essentially chose to sit the election out from a party perspective. They
Okay.
didn't kind of get their get out to vote linked together. And this gets back to the Eagles versus Giants thing, which is basically the conservative Democrats were like, we kind of have a coalition with the Republicans and we can bring a lot of resources to South Jersey. And they didn't endorse Christie, but they didn't get out the vote for Bono. And Bono's like been furious in some of the public
Mm,
appearances. And as we get further away, is a little clearer. And I think one of the other kind of things I've been trying to keep a pulse on is how much is South Jersey activated to get out the vote for Cheryl? Like, how much are these kind of old school political parties kind of going door to door
yeah.
and activating their voters? And my sense is it's not a ton, and there's a sense that Cheryl hasn't been in South Jersey. I just got invited to, there's a rally in Camden County this weekend, but there's almost a sense that Cheryl has to prove herself in kind of an old school Jersey politics. Like, what are you going to do for us type of a way to get those turnout groups out? And this would be the other thing I'd look at. If there's really weird splits with South Jersey, it may be an indication that essentially there was kind of an intra-party battle between North and South that
Hmm.
cut her off at the knees. I don't think we're seeing it like with Christie was public, right? Christie was in South Jersey all the time. There was, billions of dollars flowing north to south. It was very, very visible. Like there were key leaders in the party that were doing public appearances with him. We're not seeing anything like that. But I'm hearing kind of South Jersey folks frustrated that they're not getting more attention, and North Jersey folks frustrated that they're not getting more retail support.
Interesting.
Let me ask this. It seems to me, listening to you, that this may come down to who do New Jerseyans blame for their unhappiness, especially about electric prices? Is it the national Republicans who control things, or the state level Democrats who control things? And whoever they blame is going to determine this race. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think that's super fair.
And then the next question that jumps out at me is, it seems to me that the narrative the last couple of weeks has been, oh no, this race is closing. Cheryl could lose. Chitterelli could win. There's some real danger here for Democrats. The usual Democratic bedwetting. Is there a scenario in here where Cheryl wins by what we would have thought to be a relatively unimpressive amount, but it's large enough that the narrative is, oh wow, that was a lot bigger than we expected. Like we said, it was going to be a close race, and she won by 6, 7, 8 points, and now that kind of the expectation setting ends up making it a big win, even though
Hmm.
it really wasn't. Is that a possibility here?
Yeah, I mean it's tough because I consume this mostly through New Jersey news, and I think the New Jersey folks were kind of way out in front of this. And if folks want to get really deep into New Jersey politics, I think Matt Friedman with Politico does an
Oh yeah,
unbelievable news, and
he's
it's
great.
just so good, you know. Um, but but I think it's right. I think there was always kind of a little folks haven't caught up to the fact that New Jersey just isn't quite as blue. You're not going to just see these blowout victories, especially under these political circumstances.
Right,
Um, but I don't think it was, the toss-up polls. I think were just largely polls that kind of had some weird weighting. I
right,
don't think it was ever
right.
kind of a pure toss-up. Now the polling quality isn't quite, at the poll I saw this morning's 5, but it's, um,
I guess if you look at the last 3 or 4 polls, which are
yeah,
relatively high quality pollsters, she's basically up between like 5 and 8 points.
yeah,
Um, and it's just, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's funny. I don't. I mean, I grew up in Pennsylvania. I live in New York. I know a little about Jersey politics, but I do feel as though these races tend to be determined by the national mood. And especially now because the national mood is so I don't know what's the word, visceral, as far as either hatred or love for Trump, and although more hatred than love. And I just think that it's just hard to get away from that right now. I mean, you're seeing this in these special elections, which Democrats are basically going 15 or 16 points above what Kamala Harris did in 2024. I mean, they are crushing any special elections. I realize those are highly motivated voters who come out and vote special elections. But this is an off-year election. I would imagine you're probably getting a large percentage of highly motivated voters as well. So it just feels as though, and then tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, I want to put you on the spot here, but if you were if I were to ask you like 2 weeks from now, do you think that that Mikey Shell is going to be the governor elect in New Jersey?
Yep. Yeah, I think Cheryl's going to win. I've had Cheryl +4 from very early on. I always thought it was going to tighten up a little more than anyone was comfortable with. But I think part of what you're seeing is there's just so many folks are locked into their partisan votes that the fundamentals
Exactly.
matter, and it makes it
Exactly.
such an uphill climb for
Yeah.
Republicans. The reason I think you're not going to see kind of one of these blowout elections is this kind of historical. You have the two Democratic term, like there's some historical winds that are blowing in Cheryl's face, and so I actually think the Murphy race last cycle is like a great example. Where the fundamentals kind of carried him through, but it was tighter and it was a little nervous.
He won by 3 points, and I believe that
Right.
was closer than the polls had suggested, wasn't it? Or
Yeah, it
maybe
was a
I'm wrong
little
about
close
that.
in the polls, and I'm expecting something similar. I'm expecting the polls to end up at 7 and us to get down to 4 or so, just in the sense that there are a lot of folks here that are just kind of frustrated, the retail stuff, the cost of life stuff, and I do think Democrats are owning that locally, but the national politics just lock in so many voters. It's a heavy hill for Republicans to climb at the state level.
Yeah.
I want to build off of something Steve said because I think it's really important both now and for next year for the midterms. The first decision that any pollster makes is how they weight the electorate, i.e., what percentage of Democrats will be in the electorate, what percentage of Republicans, what percentage of women, what percentage of men. And in a lot of these races in the last year or two, they've hedged much more with they've hedged much more towards Trump because they're worried that there's this like hidden Trump population. And in some cases, I think that is going to lead to surprising Democratic victories. And so I do think that there's this question of waiting of what does the electorate look like, and as long as it's not surprisingly bad for Democrats, that Cheryl is still pretty well positioned, given all things considered. And before we let Steve go, I want to throw one story out there. I'm editing a piece now. I edited a history section called Made by History, and I'm editing a piece for next week. I didn't realize this until then. The reason New Jersey has off-year gubernatorial elections is that in 1940, they elected a Democratic governor on Franklin Roosevelt's coattails, and the next Republican governor said absolutely not, never happening again. They had a constitutional convention and they went to these off-year elections so that FDR could not sweep in any more Democrats. That's how this happened. Steve, parting thoughts. Anything else you want to add?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me on. Big fan.
Thanks for being
Enjoy
with us.
kind of the chance to get on and chat politics. I think the last thing I'll close with is there was a little push Murphy made to try to move New Jersey up in the primaries, in part because it is in a lot of ways a cross section of the country, right? So I think folks were surprised about Latino voters and the Latino coalition in the last presidential election, but you saw it in New Jersey because the New Jersey as a country is a really similar number. You have your 22% Latinos in the state. And so one of the things I think that's a takeaway here is that there's a lot of different ways we can think of this New Jersey race as just giving us a sneak peek into where we go next. And I think my biggest take on it is those fundamentals are going to really matter. Folks are bifurcated into their
Hmm.
camps. And the voters that are left, the things that matter is the way things hit your checkbook. And so the question is, how does that play out in New Jersey, and what does that mean for the next races coming up?
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's great. That's a great point. Thank you so much.
All right.
Really, really great to have you here. Thank you for
Wonderful.
joining
Yeah,
us.
Yeah, we'll have to do it
thanks
again.
for joining us.
Absolutely.
All right, so Michael, we got 20 minutes left, and I want to come back to the point that we were on before we started talking with Steve, because it all fits together. This is about what do Democrats have to do from a nomination standpoint, and there's
Yeah.
one name I want to throw on the table because we talked about him last week, and now he's back in the news, and that is Mandela Barnes, who we
Yeah.
held up last week as an example of, hey, if you nominate the wrong guy, he could lose. Well, he's apparently running for governor again, and or is going to declare in the next couple of weeks. And there's a lot of concern apparently in Wisconsin that he's got the most name recognition of all the candidates. He's got the best operation, and that puts him at an advantage in a primary. But that he could well, fumble away the gubernatorial election because he's just not electable.
I mean,
And
did he win statewide as lieutenant governor? Did he run with Evers
He
when he was
did.
lieutenant
He
governor?
he ran with Evers. He won as lieutenant governor, but I think the issue with the lieutenant governor's race is people don't invest a lot in opposition research, or they held back, figuring, hey, this is a young guy who's going to run for something later, and we'll hold back on some of these things he said that voters are not going to like. And the bottom line was, in 2022, Tony Evers, the kind of as boring as it gets, dry Democratic governor, was reelected by 3 points. Mandela Barnes challenged Ron Johnson, the U.S. senator, who is quite frankly the king of the crackpot caucus.
He
He is
is.
just there is no conspiracy theory the man doesn't like. I always come back to Mitt Romney's description. He said, at least Ron is an honest crackpot.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. I think it's fair
It's
from Mitt.
he was incredibly vulnerable, and Barnes lost by 1 point. And I know that there are people who say, well, if National Democrats had just put more money behind him, he would have won. But the fact is, he had vulnerabilities that other candidates didn't have. And it's a
Look,
sign that if you nominate the wrong candidate, you're going to pay for it. Even if it's
look,
only 3 or 4 points, that can cost you a race.
I agree. Although I do think, and I mean, I've had people in Wisconsin say this to me, and I mean, I think there's different views about this, but I do think you can't escape the fact that Wisconsin's never elected a black man or black woman to a statewide election, a statewide seat, and so he's not governor or senator, and that may have cost him in 2022 against Johnson.
Just 1 point off of that. I think Michael's talked about this about Democrats nominating women for president. Now this is about race, and my attitude, and I think it's Michael's, is we think this is terrible. We think that Democrats should be
Oh,
able to nominate a
100%,
woman,
100%.
and she should be able to win the presidency. We think that Wisconsin voters should absolutely be willing to nominate an African or elect an African American to Senate or governor's races. But I think that Democrats have to be pragmatic. Where these things exist, we can't change the voters quickly. Those are often long-term kinds of things. And I think you have to be cognizant of these factors because realistically speaking, you cannot do any good in people's lives if you can't win. If you nominate the person who is like your ideal, but that person loses, you've gained nothing.
Can I make one point
And
though
yeah,
about? Can I interject one thing? I think this is important about the women's issue. Look, I do think the Democrats paid a price with male voters in 2016 and 24, but you can't ignore the Trump factor here, right? Trump plays to a certain image of hypermasculinity that I think would maybe not have been as pervasive of an issue had there been a different Republican nominee in 16 and 24. So I think it's a combination of nominating a woman and a combination of having Trump on the other side. But to your point, Wisconsin, look, I think governor's different than Senate. I think 26 will be a very good cycle for Democrats. I think Barnes, I don't know a lot about. I know that he didn't run the best race, but I don't think he's a terrible candidate. I mean, he lost by a point to Johnson. It wasn't like Andrew Gillum, who although lost by narrowly, but a race he probably should have won. I think it's a lot depends on the national mood where we are in Wisconsin in 26. Um, but it also depends who Republicans are going to nominate. Do Republicans have a
Tom,
viable
it,
candidate who can win statewide in Wisconsin? I'm not sure that they do. That,
it's Tom Tiffany is going to be the nominee, the congressman from I think it's Northwest Wisconsin. Anybody
yeah,
knows
that's right.
Wisconsin could correct that if I'm wrong. But what's interesting about Barnes is he's not Graham Plattner. These are not ethical issues. He said some things that were perceived as anti-American. He said some things that were perceived as extreme. And as Michael points out, in the swing states, in the purple states, Michael says this week after week, the party that nominates the person closer to the center tends to win.
And that's
If
Democrats.
Yeah, that's usually Democrats. That was why that race sticks out as an example of, hey, you fumbled the seat away. And I
Yeah.
think that it always, I really think that nominating candidates Jonathan Martin had this column in Politico today on how Democrats keep falling in love with these untested candidates or minimally tested candidates and sinking all this money into them and they lose. And I had one quibble with this column, which is I think nominations are an intensely specific thing based on where you are. So if you're in a swing state or a red state, or if you're in a swing state, you need someone to accuse to the center. If you're in a red state, you need someone accused to the center, but someone who's going to cut through and win you voters who your party has lost. Okay. If you're in a blue state, you can go more to the left. It's all about assessing the situation. Like the candidates that Martin said Democrats fell in love with were people like Beto and Stacey Abrams, who else did they have in Texas and
I mean,
Georgia?
first of all, I'm sorry, that's a ridiculous argument. And I like Jonathan Martin, but Beto lost by, I believe, like 3 points in Texas. It was the closest margin of any Senate race since, I don't know, like the 80s or something. And so I wouldn't criticize. Now, Beto, you can criticize because he ran for governor and then he ran for Senate again. He ran for Senate again. He ran for president, which
No,
was
flipped
a
it.
joke.
He
He
ran
ran
for
for
Senate. Then he ran to the left in a presidential race and then tried to run for governor of Texas again after saying all these
right.
anti-gun things and stuff.
So I think that was, and then as far as Stacey Abrams, I mean, look, she almost won that race against Kemp. It was very close. And then I think she went a little nuts, and went too far to the left and lost. But I just disagree with the whole premise of Jonathan's argument. By and large, Democrats are very, very good at nominating candidates who are more moderate, who are more pragmatic, who have track records. They don't go for the shiny new toy. They don't. And, Republicans do that. That's why they lose so often. Somebody pointed out today on Twitter that today is the anniversary of the Christine O'Donnell "I am not a witch" ad. That is a good example of how Republicans screw themselves by nominating people who are inexperienced in politics and end up losing. Herschel Walker is another great example of that. Blake Masters is another example. Carrie Lake, another example. I give lots of them. Democrats don't do that. I mean, Alyssa Slotkin wins in Michigan. She was a congressman before she was senator. Gretchen Whitmer was the what's it called? I think she was the head of the Democratic Party in the Michigan legislature. Tony Evers had a long experience in Wisconsin politics before he ran for governor. Josh Shapiro's attorney general. I mean, the point I'm getting at here is like the Democrats are much smarter at this. And this is why the Plattner thing is so friggin' bizarre, right? I mean, what's happening in Democratic politics is like this situation in which people are just ignoring what happened before 2024. It's like we didn't, what Democrats winning a trifecta in 2020 didn't happen. Democrats winning 40 seats in 2018 didn't happen. Democrats consistently winning in swing states, governorships, attorney generals, Senate seats. None of this happened. And it's all this overreaction to happen in 2024. And by the way, a misunderstanding that happened in 2024, right? They think Democrats lost because they didn't appeal to young male voters. They lost because there was a friggin' wave of global anti-incumbency that basically caught up every single incumbent party in the world. So it's just a complete misunderstanding of what's happening. And, Democrats are much better than Republicans. I mean, I'm going to say it right up. They are much better Republicans at nominating good, moderate, centrist, electable candidates. And they have shown this over and over again. And you look at every swing state, this is simply the case. They're better at it than Republicans.
That you could say maybe is that nominating Abrams because Stacey Evans was a more moderate candidate in that primary and a good candidate, by the way. But the problem was there, we have nothing to compare to. Democrats, the last Democrat to win the governorship of Georgia was Roy Barnes in 1998, and
No
they
one was
lost
beating Kemp for
re-election.
re-election.
Right,
Bottom line,
right, right.
every governor got a boost from COVID, and they won. So he wasn't going to lose that race.
And I think that where Democrats do have something of an issue is hey, we're going to throw a lot of money into this race against someone we hate that isn't winnable. Amy McGrath in Kentucky did this, but that was because people hated Mitch McConnell. Okay. And we see this with Marjorie Taylor Greene's opponents getting, millions of dollars of
Yeah.
money that's not going to help. You're not going to win. Democrats have a tendency to try to oust people who can't lose, because
But
they
they're
hate
not
them.
spending money on candidates who can win. Also, they're giving lots of money to candidates who can win
Right.
too.
That's absolutely right. And I also think that in both the cases of Beto and Abrams, and you mentioned this with Abrams, she was an election denier before Trump
Yeah, she
made it
was.
popular, so to
She
speak.
refused to
Uh,
concede that she lost the
right.
race.
She refused to concede. Like both of those candidates are people who were strong candidates the first time, and
Right.
then they did stupid things thereafter and were not strong the second time around.
That's right.
But
That's right.
and again though, I come back to this. If you're nominating people like that in red states where you haven't won in decades, you have no bench. There is no Tony Evers out there, who I think was
No,
the superintendent of public
that's right. That's
instruction
right.
statewide. Okay, you don't need to do that in blue states. You don't need to do that in purple states. I mean, one thing that scares me in Pennsylvania a little bit is that Republicans, the deal, and this is a little bit of background why I roll my eyes every time Republicans complain about mail balloting. The deal that got them mail balloting in got Democrats mail balloting in Pennsylvania, got rid of straight ticket voting. And what ended up happening was since then, Republicans have done much better in the three row offices that are on the ballot in presidential years. We're weird in that we have gubernatorial elections and midterms, but state attorney general, state treasurer, and state auditor are elected in presidential years. And Republicans now hold all three. And that concerns me because your strongest candidates tend to be people who are vetted in statewide races. We have a
Yeah.
good bench of congressmen who may run for things in the coming years, but it's something, building a bench is important. And if you don't have one, it becomes a lot harder to crack through at the statewide level because you don't have those tested candidates who don't have skeletons that are going to destroy them. Um, and look, people are slipping through even at the congressional level. Hello, George Santos. I see you, New York Times over there, who apparently couldn't uncover any of this.
I know.
Um,
Until after the
but
election. Until after the
until
election.
after the election. But the
But
more tested your candidate is, the better off they are. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that you run retreads who have lost. One problem I think Chuck Schumer's had is he's reached for like Ted Strickland in Ohio, who had lost his last election and was
I'm gonna
old.
s- I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna give Chuck Schumer all the praise in the world, particularly for this cycle. Right? He looked at
In
these
general, I
races.
think he's a great recruiter.
I think first of all, he's a good party Senate party. He's a good Senate leader. I'll say that. I think he's better than people give him credit for. But on recruiting, right? North Carolina, the best candidate was Roy Cooper. He got Roy Cooper into the race. In Ohio, the best candidate was Sherry Brown. Doesn't mean Sherry Brown's going to win, but he's in the race. The best candidate in Maine, without question, is Janet Mills, and she is in the race. And she's going to be the nominee, not Graham Plattner. And he didn't get Edwards in Louisiana, which might have put that race in play. He might still get Mary Peltola in Alaska, which would be huge because she could take on Dan Sullivan. Um, I think they're going to try to clear the decks for Colin Allred in Texas, who, from the polling I have seen, it does better than any other Democrat, and is actually, the poll I saw today is leading Dan Patrick, who's the Attorney General, over in a head-to-head matchup. The Democrats have to pray that Dan Patrick is the nominee, because if he is, they might actually win that race. If it's Cornyn, I don't think they will win the race. But the point I'm getting at here is that Schumer is much better than people give him credit for. And here's the last thing I'll say about this that makes me crazy. People are like, oh, Janet Mills is just a pick of the DSCC. She's a pick of the Democratic elite. Guess what? The Democratic elite and the DSCC know more about politics than you do. Okay? And they are better at this than you are. They are better than you, Mr. Pundit Analysis on line, who thinks you know smarter, you know better than these people. You don't. Okay? They looked at the race and they concluded Janet Mills was the best person to win that race. And guess what? They were right. And unlike Graham Plattner's campaign, they probably vetted Graham Plattner and saw that he was a friggin' disaster. And that's why they got Mills to run. So I guess I'm sick and tired of this argument from Democrats that somehow they think they're smarter, people who do this for a living. The reality is Democrats keep winning swing state elections with Senate candidates. They won in Michigan with Celissa Slotkin. They won in Nevada with Mastro and Rosen. They won repeatedly there. They won with Mark Kelly. They won with John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. They won with John Fetterman. Oh, that's not going to happen again. They continue to do well. And I just think it is exhausting to consistently see these arguments that ignore how effective Democrats are at recruiting the right candidates to win these races.
I mean, and first of all, Janet Mills isn't the choice of the DSCC. She's the choice of Maine voters. They elected her governor twice. That's
Twice.
why she's at the top of the DSCC list. Okay, and look, parties are not perfect. They blunder on occasion in this regard. Um, and I think that, they're you're going to have those flubs, but they have polling, they have opposition research. There was just a poll in Alaska, an independent poll yesterday showing Mary Patola ahead of Dan Sullivan, the incumbent
Exactly.
Republican senator. If she runs, that is a toss-up race. That is winnable in a state that there's no other candidate that's possible.
Right.
So a lot of this about being smart and pragmatic and figuring out who has won in places before, who is vetted, who is tested. Um, and if you want to roll the dice on people who are inspirational and charismatic, the two places you do that are blue states where it's a safe seat and red states where you don't have those kinds of candidates. In the swing state kind of areas, you have to be very ruthlessly pragmatic. And the same thing goes for the
Yes.
red states. If you have that person, if you have a governor, if you have somebody else, then yeah, you want to nominate that person. And I really think it's that simple.
I wrote about this on Friday, but if you want to elect a younger Democrat, then support Seth Moulton in Massachusetts. I mean,
Yeah.
I know he's more moderate than Markey, but he's 35 years younger. And look, that seat, no matter who is the nominee, a Democrat is going to be the next senator from Massachusetts. Okay, whether it's Moulton or Markey, you want generational change, go with Moulton because he's younger, and you're not putting the seat in risk. You go with Plattner over Mills, you're putting a seat at risk. I say it's more than risk. You're basically throwing that seat away. And even okay, Lynn, I get you don't like Moulton. That's fine. I'm just making a general point that there are places to make a generational change, to choose a different Democrat. And I actually think in a lot of these places where Democrats are in safe seats, that younger Democrats should challenge these older Democratic senators because there does need to be a changing of the guard in Washington. And I would like to, I mean, it doesn't have to be Seth Moulton. It could be, well, I wouldn't go for Ayanna Presley, but it could be somebody else in Massachusetts to be that nominee. I don't think it should be Markey. Markey should step down, or at the very least I think I'm all in support of. I shouldn't say step down. He should run. If he wins, he wins. But I'm all in support of trying to primary older Senate Democrats who are in safe seats. But it's not a safe seat. Means not even a fucking Democratic seat, it's a Republican seat. Like, so why you can't take a risk with this? And I'll make the point I made at the beginning. Politics is a ruthless game. Okay. It's a ruthless, ruthless game. And it is not about being right all the time. It's not even about being the best candidate. It's about what is the best thing for a political party. And in this particular situation, the best thing for Democrats is to win that seat. And who is the candidate most likely to do it? It's not Graham Plattner. And by the way, I'd say for the record, there is something actually quite selfish about Plattner continuing on this course when he has got so many vulnerabilities and so many, even if he wins the primary, he is going to be a very flawed and scarred candidate to face off in general election. Okay. He should drop out. And frankly, every single person who's backing him should be urging him to drop out. I don't care if you like Janet Mills. I don't give a shit. I don't even know Janet Mills. I don't care anything about Janet Mills. All I know is that that she is the most Democrat most likely to win that seat, and that's why Democrats should be supporting her. Period.
I,
End of conversation.
I disagree slightly with Michael in that I'd flip the formulation he just offered. I don't like primarying older Democrats who are still, doing a decent job for the simple reason I don't like diverting money away from defeating Republicans.
There's plenty of money to go around.
I do think those people should step aside. Step aside, clear the deck for the next generation. And don't waste money in primaries that you don't need to waste because you've served your 20 years, you've served your 30 years. To answer the question that came in the chat, I believe that the issue with Moulton for some is that he's too moderate. Peter, you're asking for a Wisconsin recommendation. It is too early. We do not know. The field is not fleshed out. That is something we will definitely give you in the coming weeks, but there's still questions about who's going to run and who isn't going to run. One other thing I want to get out there before, because I'm running late here on time, but new information on that Indiana redistricting is in Playbook PM that just came out a few minutes ago. Apparently, the state Senate leaders have now said on the record to Politico that they don't have the votes for redistricting. However, it appears that the White House and the governor disagree with them, that they've conducted some sort of polling of their caucus, and they think that the opposition is actually the Senate leadership. So Governor Mike Braun, who is another Trump toady, may well call a special session next week and try to force them to vote on it. and gamble that people are not going to want to cross Trump publicly. So stay tuned on that Indiana redistricting thing, because there may be more to come.
Okay, one thing I'm going to say, whenever you jump off, by the way, I'll stay on for a few more minutes for people who have more questions. So just when you have to go, that's fine. I'll stick around a little bit longer. I want to say one thing in Wisconsin really quick. I think it's sort of an interesting situation. I wrote this piece. I did a sort of deep dive on a bunch of the swing states in after the 2024 election. And one thing I noticed about Wisconsin is really interesting is that, there was criticism on the left that Kamala Harris made a huge mistake in uh, uh, what's it called, campaigning with with Republicans like Lynn Cheney, and she did an event in Waukesha, Wisconsin, with Lynn Cheney. And I went back and I looked at this, and I was curious about this. It turns out that actually Kamala Harris did better in Waukesha County, so there are three counties around Milwaukee, the WOW counties,
WOW.
Waukesha, right? There's Washington, Waukesha, and I cannot pronounce those
Koozie or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. And they've traditionally been conservative strongholds, and they've basically been the strongholds for Republicans in the state. Those numbers, those have begun to shift. In Waukesha County, which has traditionally been one of the most conservative suburban districts in the country, Harris actually improved her margins vis-a-vis Biden. Very few places she did that, but she did better than Biden did in Waukesha. Now, I'm not saying it's because she had Liz Cheney show up, although you could make the argument. But it's certainly interesting that in places like Waukesha, that you would not think that a Democrat would do well 20 years ago, 10 years ago, they're now doing well. And I think in places like in Wisconsin, this speaks to where Democrats have an opportunity. And you saw this in the Senate Supreme Court election that happened earlier this year, right, in April, where
April, and there's another one coming next April.
Right. And Democrats won by like 10 points on that one. That was basically a referendum on abortion. But what's happened in places like Wisconsin, even though Trump won there, Tammy Baldwin did succeed. She did win. You do see this. There is this decline Democrats are experiencing, which we talked about with earlier about New Jersey among some minority voters. But what's really also important that people are not, I think, paying attention to, there's been a dramatic shift in the support of suburban voters toward Democrats, and you see this in Michigan, in places like Macomb County. What's the other county around? I can't think of the name of it
You're
right
talking
now.
about Oakland, aren't you?
Oakland County.
Oakland
Thank
County.
you. You've seen this in Bucks County and Montgomery County and Delaware County, especially around Philadelphia. You've seen this around in Harris County, which is where Houston is in Texas. You've seen this in a lot of places, but you've definitely seen it around Milwaukee. And I think there's a lot of bad news out there for Democrats, but one thing they have going for them is they have really made inroads into those suburban voters, suburban educated voters, and in many cases, women. And I think what really propelled them to victory in 2018 and in 2020 was that strong support among suburban voters, not just women, by the way. In 2020, they made real inroads among men, which, by the way, I think is because they had a male nominee in Joe Biden. That is the key for, and I mention around Georgia too. That they've done very well in the Atlanta suburbs.
Gwinnett, Cobb, DeKalb County, and I'd also
Fulton
throw
County,
Mecklenburg.
Fulton, yeah.
Yeah, and Fulton is the city
Fulton is
itself.
Atlanta, yeah, right.
I'd also throw Mecklenburg County outside, which is Charlotte.
If you look at North Carolina, and I did a deep dive in North Carolina, it's really interesting because the places where Harris really, really did well, she did better than Biden in a few places in North Carolina. Most of them were in the suburbs. The place where she lost ground, actually, were districts that were majority Black districts, interestingly enough. That's where she lost ground. But she absolutely made inroads in those suburban communities around Charlotte and around Raleigh-Durham.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And I just want to emphasize something Michael said, and then I apologize because I do have to jump off. We're earlier today because of me. Next week we'll be back at the regular time. Yeah. I just have an appointment I got to run to. But I would add that Milwaukee is so important. And the reason she had Liz Cheney in Waukesha is that their suburbs have been the most resistant to going blue. They're still voting, still more Republican votes than Democratic votes out of those places, even as those margins have slipped. In these other places, Democrats are now winning in the suburbs. And it has been the biggest shift in our politics over the last 30 years. One other thing I want to throw out for those of you who subscribe to the World According to Brian, subscribe to Truth and Consequences, subscribe to the World According to Brian. We're not good at pitching ourselves, but
We're
for
really
those of
not.
you who subscribe, I did not get to do. There's a couple of rants I have about the media, and how the media just swallows Republican talking points. So I'm going to record that later for tomorrow morning. For those of you who want to subscribe, I'll have that video for you tomorrow. And for everyone else, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Michael will stick with you.
I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes. Thank you, Brian. Always great to be with you. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'm happy to. I can do a quick, answer Q&A session if you want. But I just want to speak to this point. I do think that the suburban vote is really crucial. And by the way, the thing about why it's so crucial is that suburban voters, especially educated voters, so educated suburban voters, are the ones tend to vote, and they tend to vote in. Um, Bigger numbers than they are not occasional voters. They vote every election. It's one of the reasons why Democrats have done so well in special elections over the past couple of years. Special elections really, um, you need committed voters to come out and vote, and those voters increasingly are Democratic voters. It's one of the reasons why Democrats are, like I said, they're doing 15 or 16 points better than Harris did in 2024 in special elections in 2025. It's why I expect them to win in New Jersey and Virginia because again, you have a smaller turnout, but it tends to, the voters who do vote out tend to be lean Democratic. And okay. And I think that you will see that in midterms as well. So, I think there are a lot of things that are bad for the Democratic Party right now. But I think this is an important point I think is worth remembering that they have made inroads and solidified their gains with the voters who are the most likely to vote. And that is going to help them in special elections. And it's going to help them in midterm elections. It's less of it's not as helpful in presidential elections. Although, my theory on this is that without Trump on the ticket, Republicans are going to have a harder time getting the kind of turnout that they got in 2016 and 24 that allowed them to win the White House those years because Trump is a very unique candidate, sui generis candidate who appeals to some voters who only vote for him. I actually looked. It's funny. I looked at this over the week as I was having an argument with a friend of mine about this. Like in Nevada, for example, Trump won the state versus Kamala Harris in 2024. Jackie Rosen won her Senate race against Adam Laxalt. It was Laxalt? No, Sam Brown. Sorry. And what I noticed was that something like 8 to 9% of Trump voters didn't vote for Sam Brown. I mean, in other words, the margin between Sam Brown, the Republican Senate candidate, and Trump was about 8%. So Brown got 8% less than Trump did. By and large, it's hard to say those people voted for Harris because I voted for Jackie Rosen because Rosen and Harris's numbers were nearly identical. In fact, actually, Harris got more votes than Jackie Rosen did. So what that tells me, there was about 8 to 9% of Trump voters who simply just stayed home. Didn't stay home. They voted for Trump, but didn't vote down ballot for Republican candidates. That's a problem. That was a problem. It happened in 4 races. It happened in Arizona, where Trump won, but Kari Lake lost. It happened in Michigan, where Trump won, but Alyssa Slotkin defeated Mike Rogers. It happened in Wisconsin, where Tammy Baldwin won the Senate race, but Kamala Harris lost. So the question for Republicans is, can they continue to rely on those Trump-only voters? And my argument is the evidence is they can't. They couldn't rely on them in 2018. It's one of the reasons why Democrats did so well that year. They couldn't rely on them in 22. It's a good part of the reason why Democrats did better than be expected. They couldn't rely on them on 2020 in the Georgia Senate races, which of course took place 6 weeks after the election in a runoff, and Democratic candidates won. Both Democratic candidates, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, won. So I think this is a problem, and I've written about this before, and I don't think people pay enough attention to it. That Republicans have a long-term problem that they do not have a strategy for what to do after Trump leaves office. And that, could show up in lots of different ways. But I think one way it shows up is that they just don't succeed in getting these occasional Trump voters out. And those occasional Trump voters are essential to Republicans win the White House in 28, I think. And, to that point, I mean, I ask this question to people all the time. And I'll just ask it to you. By the way, good questions. Please put them in the chat. In 2024, Donald Trump was almost assassinated. Had he been assassinated, who do you think would have been the Republican nominee? Keep in mind, this assassination attempt happened before he picked J.D. Vance as his running mate. I've asked the question to people all the time, and nobody has a good answer for it because there's no obvious person who could have replaced Trump on the ticket. Ron DeSantis wasn't very popular. Nikki Haley really wasn't popular among the MAGA crowd. There was no obvious successor to Trump. I mean, the name that I came up with, actually, I mean, ironically, was Donald Trump Jr., which is a joke, but it seemed like the only person I could come up with who might have been a replacement for Trump had he been killed. And that speaks to a much larger problem the Republican Party has, which is that they have put all their chips in on Trump, and they don't have a plan B. And so when Trump leaves, there's no obvious person. Now, you could say Vance. I'm unconvinced about J.D. Vance's political skills, to put it mildly. And uh, and even if in 2028, you will almost certainly see a very competitive primary between Vance. I think Marco Rubio is going to run. I assume Brian Kemp is going to run. I think Chris Sununu is going to run. Um, Ted Cruz probably will run. I don't know if DeSantis might run, although I think he might be done. So it's going to be a very competitive primary in which each Republican candidates are going to be, I expect, to try to out-Trump the other one, because that's where the sort of energy in the party is. It's on the MAGA right. So they're going to see who can go further and further to the right, which of course will turn people off who are not Republicans. But I think also, I don't know that it'll be convincing to MAGA world, right? Trump is convincing to them on these issues because he's Trump, and I don't know that other Republicans will be as effective at it. So I just think this is a major long-term problem for the Republican Party that no one is talking about. And you're kind of seeing some evidence of it already in some of the recruiting for 2026 that, well, I mean, I go back and say you saw it in 24, in 22. 22, Republicans should have picked up seats in the Senate, and they didn't. So they nominated just terrible candidates, right? Herschel Walker, Georgia Republicans won every single statewide race in Georgia in 22, except for the Senate race. That's because Herschel Walker was a bad candidate. I don't know that Mark Kelly was beatable in 22 in Arizona, but I know that Blake Masters wasn't the guy to do it. Um, I think that in Michigan, in Wisconsin and Nevada, Republicans had kind of underwhelming candidates, and that almost certainly cost them chances to pick up those 3 seats. I'd say in Pennsylvania, they had a better candidate in Dave McCormick. That's one of the reasons why they won. Also, I think Bob Casey ran a bad race, although I wish Brian was here to talk about more about that. I just think that they have a candidate problem, and they're going to keep, because of Trump's control over the party and because how pervasive MAGA is in the party, you're going to keep getting these extreme Republicans. Now, in red states, that's good for them, right? In red states, the more extreme you are, the better chance you have of winning a primary and getting elected. But in purple states, in blue states, it's going to be a problem. So I think this is a long-term issue for Republicans that I think people should be talking about. Somebody's asking if Zoom fundraisers for ads that target specific demographics actually work. I have no idea. Sorry, I'm not good at fundraising. But since you bring up fundraising, I'll mention something that Chris Hayes mentioned today in a article. I put it in for those of you who are paid subscribers, I would put in the what's going on right up. If you're not a paid subscriber, you should certainly join up today. $5 a month, $75 a year. It's a bargain. He mentioned in the piece that fundraising is overrated as a skill for Democratic candidates, which I kind of agree with, in the sense that it's not as hard to raise money as it used to be. But fundraising still matters, and you still need to basically, especially in down ballot races, especially in House races, you need to outraise your opponents in order to win. Susan Collins has raised $6 million in Maine. That's a lot of money for her super PAC already, and the race is a year away. To compete with her in that state, Democrats are going to have to raise as much money as she does. Now, Grant Planner raised a ton of money initially, which is one of the reasons why he gets so much attention. I know Janet Mills raised like a shitload of millions of dollars for the first 24 hours in the race, but she's going to have to raise a lot of money. And I do think that it is easier for a candidate like Janet Mills to raise money because she is well known, because she has a network of donors who've funded her campaigns the last not two cycles, but last two gubernatorial campaigns that she ran. Money is not. There are lots of ways for candidates to raise money, but and I think for Senate races it isn't that hard. Presidential races it isn't hard at all. But down ballot, it's really, really important, and I wouldn't dismiss it completely. One thing that Chris Hayes argues is that Democrats need more attention seeking. They need to capture the attention of voters, and that's something they're failing to do. And I'm reading his book now, actually, which I think is very interesting on the attention economy. It's a really good. I'm glad he wrote it. I think it's a good thesis to explore about how much of our world now is defined by the need to get attention. But I don't think attention seeking is what Democrats need to do. I really don't. I'll use the example of 2020. I mean, who was the more attention seeking candidate, Trump or Biden? In 22, Carrie Lake ran against Katie Hobbs in 18, a governor's race, and she was a more attention seeking candidate, and she lost. That was in 2020 she ran, maybe. I can't remember now. She lost. Um, uh, in general, I mean, like Tony Evers is a great example we mentioned earlier. Tony Evers is like the most boring candidate you could ever see. He's won 2 terms as governor in Wisconsin. I think attention seeking is overrated, and I think a lot of voters are turned off by it. I think Trump is the exception, not the rule. I think steady and slow sort of wins the game in politics more than anything else. And I do think that a lot of Democratic candidates, especially in swing states, have been very effective at hewing to sort of a moderate kind of sensible course, and that has helped them win. And look, I think moderate and centrist these are terms that are overrated in our politics, and people don't understand what they mean necessarily. But extreme is a term that does matter, and extreme candidates tend to turn off voters. And I think the better way to put it is that Republicans are more likely to nominate extreme candidates who hold extreme positions, and that hurts them. Democrats do not nominate extreme candidates; they really don't. I can think of maybe Andrew Gillum, but he wasn't really extreme. He's just more liberal. They just don't nominate extreme candidates. And it's one of the reasons why I think they do so well in some of these swing state elections, because they don't do that. It's Republicans who do it. And Republicans, because they do that, have cost themselves, so many seats over the years. It's really sort of crazy how many seats they've lost because they've nominated much more extreme Republican candidates. So I think that and candidates who seek out attention, and often negative attention. So I think Chris's argument, I want to dig into a little deeper, but I think his argument, I think sort of confuses charisma with attention. But I think this is the bigger picture here, which is that Democrats are doing a lot of things that are working. They didn't work in 24. Although, again, I keep bringing this up. It did work in 24 down ballot. It didn't work in the presidential campaign. It worked in the Senate races. Okay, it worked in Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona and Nevada. Almost worked in Pennsylvania. They nominated, and they had candidates who won in states where Trump won. That says something about the kind of nominees that Democrats had, and it says something about the kind of nominees Republicans had. They weren't good nominees. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, that for all the shitting on Democrats right now, I think a lot of it is sort of missing the bigger picture, and missing the picture of what the problem of Democrats is. And last thing I'll say, and I made this point yesterday in my post, for those of you who read it, if not, Truth and Consequences, truthandcons.com, please take a look. The argument I made yesterday was that Trump is very unpopular, and that has led to a resurgence in support for Democrats. And there's really no reason to believe that won't continue, because I don't really think Trump's going to do things that are going to make him more popular. This stuff with paying himself $230 million from the Department of Justice, this stuff with knocking down the East Wing of the White House, I do think is actually a real political liability. I think people are going to get ticked off about that. All this stuff hurts him, and it just energizes Democrats. And again, I don't know how you can, the Times, I mentioned yesterday this piece by the Times, by Shane Goldmacher, that was basically saying, like, Democrats aren't being positive enough in their campaigns. It's just a stupid argument. They're better. The smart campaign is running against Trump. That's what they're doing. But that was on page 1 of the Times. On page A23 was an article about the No Kings rally. What the fuck? 7 people show up and it's on A23? Believe me, that's a much bigger story than Shane Goldmacher's navel gazing. And it is sort of frustrating that how much of the coverage seems to sort of ignore. There is just I don't know what the Times, it's not just the Times, but it's a lot of it is the Times. This like just predilection toward just shedding on Democrats every chance they can get. And um, ignoring the things Democrats are doing correctly. It is really, I don't know what's driving it. I think it's the Times, just they're afraid of being perceived as too liberal, so they sort of bend over backwards. But um, it's kind of aggravating. Anyway, I think I'm going to finish up here unless anybody has any other questions they want to ask. 237 people at the end. I really appreciate that. That's awesome. Um, Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for being here with me today, and with Brian and our guest Stephen Danley, who was really interesting on New Jersey politics. I love doing these things. I love having you guys here. I love talking with you. Please send comments, questions. Please subscribe to Truth and Consequences if you haven't already. Please subscribe to What's the World According to Brian, because it's fantastic. And we will see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye bye.